This is a video showing you how to lower your shocks on any one of your RCs. For this video, I'm going to be showing you how to do this with the Traxxas Rustler. Now, these shocks are the Ultra shocks that Traxxas makes. However, oil-filled shocks throughout any one of the RC companies are nearly identical. So you can use this process for pretty much any RC. Let's get started. So you're going to need a certain kind of tube in order for you to do this. A lot of people prefer to use a fuel line from a Nitro RC, which you can find at any RC hobby place. However, I'm going to go ahead and use poly tubing, which you can find pretty much at any home improvement place. It's a kind of tubing that's commonly used in plumbing, especially for swamp coolers, and it's relatively cheap. Either way, whichever one you choose to use, you're going to need at least 1 foot of it. You're also going to need a pair of pliers with a paper towel and enough shock oil to refill all the shocks that you plan on lowering. The last thing that you're going to need is a dark marker. You're going to be making marks on the shafts and you need to see where the mark is. And I would highly advise that you use a black permanent one. Now, the first thing that you got to do is figure out the right height that you want your RC to sit at. So what you're going to want to do is remove the bottom screw to your shocks and take off the shock springs. You're going to want to remove every one of the shock springs on your RC. Once you remove the shock spring, it's time to figure out your ride height. For me, what I did was I just laid down a notebook and I put the RC on top and then pushed the RC all the way down. This gave me a very low profile, which is exactly what I was looking for. Now, one thing that you're going to want to be sure of is that the height of the back is the same as the front. Not to mention, when you look at the front of it, you want it to be completely level. That's why I used a notebook, because, well, that's about as level as you can get. Now, once you get your desired height, what you're going to want to do is get your permanent marker and mark the very top of the shaft. But you only have to do this for one side. The reason for that is that the measurement on the other side is going to be the same exact size. So choose the left or the right and mark the shocks on the front and the back. Once you got your shocks marked, you're going to want to take them off from the RC, and now it's time to get all the oil out of each one of the shocks. So unscrew the shock cap and empty out all the silicone oil that's inside. Once you empty out all the oil, it's time to remove the rod end. And this is when the paper towel comes in handy, because you're going to want to unscrew this, and that's when you use your pliers. You don't want to scratch up this rod shaft. If you do that, then it's going to mess up the shock and it will leak. So be sure not to scratch it up. There are tools for this, but the majority of the time this gets the job done just as well. Just hold it down and unscrew it. Just be sure you hold it down tight enough and you're not just rotating the shaft inside of the paper towel. Otherwise, you might erase your mark. One last thing I should go ahead and tell you is that make sure that the paper towel that you're using, if you are using this method, is folded over several times, because you want it to be very padded, because yeah, those will rip up your shaft. Now, once you get the rod end off, you're going to go ahead and push out the shaft itself. Now it's time to work with that tube. You're going to start by cutting off 1 inch of tubing. Now, before I begin, I'm going to go ahead and let you know the difference between fuel line and poly tube. With fuel line, it is very flexible, and as the shock uses the fuel line as a spacer pretty much, it's going to be compressing on the fuel line, and as you can see, it does shrink a little bit. With poly tube, you cannot do that. It is very solid plastic, not to mention it's durable, and that is why I prefer to use poly tube. But anyways, let's go ahead and get the tube, and you're going to slide it onto the shock shaft. Now you're going to reinsert it into the body and pull it out. And as you can see, it can only come out so far. At this point, this is when that mark becomes very important. So what you're going to want to do is remove the tube, cut off a little bit at a time, and keep doing this until you see that mark come out of the shock body. And as you can see, there is the mark. So now this is at the right length that I want it to be. Now what I'm going to do is pull out this tube and cut out an identical size for the other side of the RC. And now I'm done with the front shocks. Another important note, since you are going to be pulling the shock shaft in and out of the shock body, remember to be careful. The threading at the rod end could rip up the seals, and that's not something you want to do. And if you want to, you can go ahead and rub off that mark. And if it doesn't come off since you used a permanent marker, feel free to use a little bit of rubbing alcohol. But the process is identical for the back. Remember, you just got to find out the size for one side in the front and in the rear. Once you do that, it's an identical size for the other side. And believe me guys, you want this size to be identical for each side of the RC. Otherwise, you're going to be having a wobbly looking RC, and that is not going to perform very well. Once you've finished installing all the tubing into each one of the shocks, it's time to reassemble it. So go ahead and get your paper towel and your pliers, hold it down, and reattach the rod end. Now, an important little note, if you lower your shock a lot, you might want to go ahead and use some needle nose pliers, because these pliers might be too thick to hold it. Once you finish installing all the rod ends, it's time to refill the shock. So a couple of tips on doing that. You're going to want to fill up the shock body about 3/4 of the way full of shock fluid. Then you're going to go ahead and pump out all of the air bubbles. Once all the air bubbles are out, fill up the shock the rest of the way and seal it. Remember, you want no air inside of the shock body, only oil. After that, feel free to go ahead and reattach the shock spring and put it back onto your RC. And that's all there is to it. As you saw, it was a very simple, cheap modification. It can be a bit lengthy, but the results speak for themselves. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this works with pretty much any oil-filled shock out on the RC market, so there is no limit to which RC you can do this with. So let your imagination be your guide. I hope this video helped you out, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask.